I'm Mark Norman, the Associate Dean of NYU Schack, and I'm incredibly happy to be here today. If you know Schack, you know that we've had this Ackman Lecture series for many years, and it honors Larry Ackman, who died last year, actually. He established this lecture in ethics specifically to think about all of the issues facing the real estate industry and how we face them. We've had an amazing array of speakers, which continues this year, and it's always topical. So last year, we had Maria Torres Springer, and we had Mark Halliday, and we were talking about all of the issues facing New York. We have somebody today that is enmeshed in all of those issues in a big way. So very happy to hear his thoughts about where we're going. And Brian and I talk quite a bit about ESG. So I don't know if you all know that all of our incoming students take ESG in commercial real estate, and it's woven in. It has to, right? All of those issues are relevant. And running an agency as big as yours, being the Comptroller of New York, which is probably bigger than a lot of states in terms of budget and employees and agencies, we're in a unique position to really make an impact. So I'm very excited to hear the Comptroller today. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian Schragle to introduce Brad Lander.
Let's have another round of applause for our dean, who's done an outstanding job this past year. You think it's easy being a dean? Nah. So, thank you very much for all showing up today at the Harvard Club. This esteemed club has a rich history, and we're very proud of the fact that we could bring it to you here today for this lecture, the Ackman Lecture, which is about ethics, right? So who better to speak about ethics but the man who manages how many billions of dollars do you manage? 260 billion dollars. They're your dollars. They're my dollars. What is he doing with it? That's what we want to know today. So really, this is going to be a Q&A at the end of his explanation. Comptroller Brad Lander is the Chief Financial Officer for the City of New York. He has 800 people or public servants that work for him. That's important to remember, right? So they're looking at the budgets. They're doing all of the bookkeeping associated to make sure that there's no stealing going on, that it's ethical where money is being presented. And more importantly, they have a huge amount of money that comes from retirees, like the woman who is standing outside today, who is a school teacher and is concerned about the controller's investment in BlackRock, a little bit company that you guys know a little bit about. So today we're going to look at what he does with the pension funds. He stewards the retirement security of over 750,000 current and retired city employees. That's sanitation workers, that's clerks, that's all the building functions that people participate in to keep the city running together. That's teachers' unions, et cetera. It's a lot of money and really an important job because the retirees really need that expense to be, that investment to be invested correctly. Now, we invited him today here because he's taken the lead in ESG investing. With the amount of money that he has that he can invest, that's very important. So it's a role model for other cities around the country. But it also is the fulcrum, right, to press other companies to invest ethically and to invest in environmentally important governance issues that we care about. I want to point out that he brought a very important guest with him today, Taffy. Taffy, you want to raise your hand? So Taffy is named the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and she is the emerging managing person who does strategy for the Comptroller's Office in those areas. And you know, as the Dean mentioned, we intertwine DEI as well as ESG in our curriculum throughout. So Comptroller Lander has managed the issuance of $7.8 billion in municipal bonds as well. those municipal bonds are going to another subject that we talk about at Schack quite often, which is infrastructure. And so obviously this week, with what was going on in Maryland, infrastructure is really important. So where that money is applied and how it's used in the city of New York, and the power that he has related to that, and where that money can come from in terms of water and sewer and other needs that we have in the city of New York is very important. Before he became the Comptroller of New York, he worked he ran and then successfully won as a city council member for 12 years. So he's open to serious Q&A at the end on all sorts of issues, not just ESG and DEI, but housing, affordable housing, crime, and other really interesting subjects that we need to be paying attention to as Schack students. So thank you very much for coming today, and please welcome Comptroller Brad Lander.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, Dean. We're really grateful for this invitation. I'm honored to speak here at the NYU Schack Institute of Real Estate as part of the Ackman Lecture series. You know, there's a certain interesting irony in the title there. I know that this talk was endowed by Larry Ackman rather than by his son Bill, who has been in the debate around some of these DEI issues. And I won't shy away from that, but I will leave it to the end of my remarks. And yeah, I'll try to leave a good amount of time for Q&A because I would love to hear what's on your mind, what you're thinking about. You've heard a little about what the Comptroller's Office does broadly, but those, you know, roughly 800 employees, we manage the pension funds for New York City public sector workers. That's $260 billion of assets under management. That is the retirement security of teachers and firefighters and police officers and school crossing guards and cafeteria workers. So that's large. I'm going to talk a lot about the investment work and our approach to responsible investing. But we also manage the municipal debt that is the investment capital for infrastructure in the city. We're the budget watchdog looking over the city's budget. We sign off on and register the city's contracts. Every year the city procures about $20 billion worth of services, and we dig in and make sure that procurement is done appropriately. We settle the city's claims. We enforce the labor law. We've got a whole interesting set of chief financial officer and chief accountability officer functions. I'm not going to talk about most of them, so you can come back and ask about any of those things. I'm really going to focus on three topics: on housing and affordable housing, on infrastructure and climate, which really is probably two issues, but I'm going to count it as sort of one, and then do some reflecting on these questions around responsible investing, whether you think of that as ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues, or diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, both how we view them from the point of view of the pension funds and the Comptroller's Office, but also a little about the politics of the backlash in the current moment and how I understand what that means. And along the way, hopefully, there'll be some things that are useful for you guys thinking as folks who are working in or interested in working in or, you know, going to have careers in real estate and real estate investing, because these questions are hard. They're fascinating, you know, navigating these issues of fiduciary duty and delivering a return for investors while also being open-eyed to the stakeholders and the issues and the externalities that come from investment. There are not easy answers to these questions. So I'm going to start by talking about affordable housing from the perspective of a big real estate investor. So out of that $260 billion, as of, you know, now, about $16.6 billion of that is in private markets real estate, essentially, and, you know, private equity real estate investments, largely in the United States, but some all around the world. So on the one hand, I'm a, you know, $16.6 billion private markets real estate investor. On the other hand, I'm someone who is a long-time passionate affordable housing and tenants' rights advocate. I'm going to talk to you, you know, maybe I'll start by talking with a little story about how those things intersect in some complicated ways. So you heard that before I was Comptroller, I was a city council member, and I represented a district in Brooklyn that includes the neighborhoods of Park Slope and Carroll Gardens and Gowanus. And in my last year of city council service in 2021, so this is well into the pandemic, we started hearing, one of our staff on my council staff, an organizer, tenant organizer, started hearing from some residents of Park Slope, tenants of Park Slope. Now, these are not like low-income tenants. These are folks who are paying $3,000 for an apartment, but and many of them had lived there for many years. You had some families raising their kids in the neighborhood. You had a few situations of students. Maybe that's 3 students in a 3-bedroom. But we're talking about units that rent for $3,000, $3,500, even $4,000. But they were starting to get eviction notices. A new owner had bought these multifamily buildings that had still some rent-stabilized units, but a bunch of units that had been deregulated years earlier. And so the market rates had risen into this $3,000 to $4,000 range, but still people had been there for many years raising their families and just having their rents go up a little each year. And basically, as soon as this new owner, Greenbrook Partners, bought their buildings, they would just blanket the building with eviction notices and tell the market rate tenants, you're out. Give eviction notices in many cases to the rent-regulated tenants, even though they had tenant protections, just to see if maybe they would leave. Then they would come and start doing construction in a really aggressive way. We came to call it construction as harassment because no one had asked for the repairs that were coming, and it was done in a way that might leave the building front door unlocked, so jeopardize your safety, a lot of noise, not managed well. And the goal, it was pretty clear, was just to push people out of this building because even though those units were paying $3,000, $3,500, probably if they got turned over, they could go for $5,000 or $6,000. And it was pretty clear that Greenbrook Partners, that was their goal, was their intention, was to get rid of the residents who were there, do some kind of cosmetic improvements, and then, double the rent rolls on the building. They make a lot of money, a good investment strategy, but if you're the city council member representing these families who have sent their kids to public schools and lived in the neighborhood for a decade or two, that was not too good. So we got involved and we started organizing. We found out that the investor in Greenbrook, there's plenty of seats, folks, so come in if you, there's a lot of room up in the front. I don't want people to have to stand in the back. Yeah, I didn't mean to embarrass you, but I don't want you to have to stand either. That doesn't seem good. There's seats up here, seats in the front row. So we did what you do. We followed the money, and the Greenbrook capital was coming from a private equity real estate firm out of London, NW1, which now is capitalized at about $1 billion. And their biggest investor at the time actually was the Texas Permanent Fund. That's not a pension fund, but it's sort of like one. It's Texas oil money left to support the Texas public school system. They had invested about $100 million in NW1 that was now coming in and kicking the residents of my district out. So we reached out to NW1, and I'm going to read you some funny emails, from the one of the principals there. And we reached out to the Texas Permanent Fund as well to say, I don't think Texas teachers and school families want to be evicting Brooklynites from their home. And we actually got one of the trustees of the Texas Permanent Fund to come up to Brooklyn, meet some of these tenants, look at some of the buildings. And I can't say that we really ever persuaded them. NW1 didn't change its Greenbrook, and NW1 and the Texas Permanent Fund didn't change their business practices. We were able to get lawyers for a lot of the tenants and help them stay in the building. But it was a really interesting, actually, I have this email between me and one of the partners at NW1 where I was trying to say, kicking people out. Well, here's this email. So, I am the son of 2 career social workers in New York. I'm certainly not out to hurt anybody, but simply to improve the quality of rundown housing with poor infrastructure in your district to make better living experiences for families and improve the conditions of the buildings. As you know, council member, the condition of housing in Park Slope is often not taken care of. Absentee owners do not reinvest in the buildings and they deteriorate. Now, I don't know how much time you guys have spent walking around Park Slope, but there are no buildings owned by absentee owners deteriorating. This is, someone trying to sleep better at night. Our investment in these free market units also helps to subsidize the low affordable rents for the rent-controlled and rent-stabilized units that helps people who truly can't afford it to stay in their apartments. Remember, they had issued blanket eviction notices on all of those rent-stabilized units. Unfortunately, there was no free lunch. And then there was this really interesting, because I went back and forth with him about the fact that, these folks had lived in our neighborhood for many years, and if they got evicted, we're going to have a very difficult time finding any place, else in the neighborhood to live. And he said the following: I certainly appreciate your view on not renewing market rate tenants, but we just have a different viewpoint. I also rent my house. Remember that this guy's got this firm with $1 billion of assets under management. And this spring, the owner asked us for it back and didn't renew my lease. He gave us 60 days, and my family and I went out and we found a new place. Yes, it was a transition for us, but we didn't own the market rate unit, so we knew we didn't have an automatic right to stay, and that is clearly our agreement. This happens every year millions of times. This is well-established law, and we believe for good reason. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the question of fiduciary duty, because as an investor where you've got beneficiaries, as we do with a pension fund, you have a fiduciary duty to your beneficiaries. And I suppose you could understand that to mean that you're responsible for maximizing every possible dollar. And therefore, if you own a real estate portfolio, you have a legal obligation to throw every single tenant out where you might be able to jack the rent up by 25 or 50 or 200%, and maybe even then have an auction for the rental unit to just see how much money you could possibly get. Now, obviously, that is not how most real estate owners interpret their fiduciary duty. It did seem to be how NW1 was interpreting it. Okay, so that's all in my time as a council member. Fast forward a year, I win this election as comptroller, and now at 1 Center Street in the municipal building. And I'm walking the halls one day, and that organizer I mentioned, her name's Nicole Christool, she runs into me in the hall, and she says, Comptroller, do you remember when we were fighting Greenbrook Partners and how funding from the Texas Permanent Fund was evicting families from their homes in Brooklyn? And I'm like, sure, Nicole, I remember that. She says, would you like to know how many $1 billion you have in funds that are evicting people from their homes in Texas and Mississippi and Missouri? And I said, sure. And she pointed me to that $16.6 billion private markets real estate portfolio, which is in many firms that buy up single-family homes and convert them to rentals, and that have been in the newspaper for operating their properties either in ways that did something similar, kind of evicted families if the rents could be jacked up, or converted entire neighborhoods from homeownership to rental, taking homeownership opportunities off the market. And I said, gee, Nicole, that's very interesting. I'm going to have to think about that. I know we have a fiduciary duty to our beneficiaries, but I don't think they want, these are the same nurses and school crossing guards, their retirement security to be secured by, kicking other nurses and school crossing guards out of their homes. And it doesn't seem like it would be a good business practice anyway. So the first time, the way most of that money is, it's in deals with these private markets or private equity managers. So they're firms like KKR or Blackstone. The first one that came up for a renewal in my tenure in office is actually called Cerberus. They're a big real estate private equity manager. Anyone know what Cerberus refers to in Greek mythology? Yeah?
Some sort of three-headed monster.
Cerberus is the three-headed dog that guards the gates of hell. So, if you name your fund that, you're not communicating that you're, really looking to look out for the interests of all stakeholders and looking to I don't think the three heads are trying to balance E, S, and G or something. I don't know that much about Greek mythology, so I might have it wrong. But I thought, hey, all right, so here's a firm that is doing just what Nicole said and just what Greenbrook is. And so they came in for the first meeting, but they had heard a little bit about me and knew my track record as someone who cares a lot about tenants' rights and affordable housing. And so they said, Comptroller, we know you have some concerns about this private markets real estate and the single family rental portfolio we have. So don't worry your pretty little head. We got a solution for you. We got plenty of other investors that really like the returns that are coming from that piece of our portfolio. How about if you just invest in everything else? We got a lot of great industrial real estate and commercial real estate, retail real estate. We'll just give you that, and you could keep your hands clean of our single family rental portfolio. I suppose you could say that would be a proposal to divest from their portion of the residential rental market. And I thought about this for a minute because I'm like, oh, that's great. Okay, now I don't have this problem. I can get the great returns from Cerberus. My hands will be clean. I'll feel good. I won't be kicking anyone out of their homes in these places. But that, really that's just like they're going to run the same fund. My money's going to be here and somebody else's money is going to be there, and nothing will change as a result. So I said, let's think about something else. And I asked a few questions. I was like, okay, do you kick people out of their homes, as soon as you think someone else would be willing to pay a few % more? How do you approach building conditions? Do you use construction as harassment? Do you bring blanket eviction notices on all the tenants when you buy the buildings, even if they're paying their rents? And they were like, no, 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 and no, we don't do those things. And I was, we said, well, what are the standards that you use? And they kind of had a few half-hearted answers to that. We're like, we had some problems early on, but we fixed them. We think our practices are even better than those ones at KKR and Blackstone and Apollo and all the other firms. So what we decided to stay instead was, rather than just sleeve off that piece of the portfolio, would you sit down with us, and we'll talk with some of those all our other real estate managers as well, and develop a set of responsible property management standards. Let's see if we could work together to figure out whether you would be willing to work with us. We'll codify what the standards are that we expect for the $16 billion we're putting out in the real estate market. And then everyone can have a good set of standards. And it was funny, what they said is, oh, we'd be glad to do that. Our concern will be that it'll be like below our level of standards. And so we said, great, that'll be a good problem to have. And so we went ahead and did this. We got a grant from the Ford Foundation and worked with a national network called For the Long Term. Worked with all of our real estate asset managers over a period of time, and they are really some of the biggest private markets real estate firms in the country, and went through kind of every single point of the real estate investment. So how do you do marketing and make sure you're complying with fair housing obligations and giving everyone, a fair opportunity to apply? What do you do about the challenge of, on the one hand, making sure people have good credit, but not excluding people who have had, a bad credit history for a reasonable reason? There's issues of people that have had criminal legal system involvement. There are things for which you don't want tenants, but if you do a blanket that anyone's ever had involvement in the criminal legal system, you're going to knock so many people out of the opportunity to rent a home. So, from tenant screening to conditions. How do you just make sure your buildings are well maintained and not a blight in the neighborhood? How do you handle these questions of lease renewals? And that was one of the toughest issues, because very important to me, we're not just throwing people out of their homes, but they do have a fiduciary duty to investors, so they got to be able to raise rents. What we developed was this set of responsible property management standards. It looks at 7 different areas of the standards. It takes great care to be consistent with our fiduciary duty and theirs. And in each case, it comes up with kind of a baseline standard, a best practice, and a series of disclosures that, so we can see whether those things are being applied. And I'm not going to go through them point by point by point, but they involve offering clear and fair leases, reducing undue burdens of security deposits. So they all agreed not to do more than 1.5 months security deposit and to return it within 14 days at the end of a lease. One area that was really interesting and kind of one of the harder ones to negotiate was we found a best practice that some firms were doing, but others weren't, of giving 30 days notice before bringing an eviction filing. So if you're going to bring an eviction filing, you give people 30 days notice, and they've got some opportunity to. In New York, most of these things, I will say, if you're a tenant in New York, are covered by New York law, but they are not covered by Mississippi law or Texas law or Missouri law or many other places around the country. But enough, they agreed enough that that became a standard. And on lease renewals and rent increases, what folks agreed to is a provision essentially that says, rents can be raised by the CPI, the inflation increase, plus 5%. And that's, sort of the standard. And if they're doing any more than that, we've got a right as investors to hear about it and understand what's going on. So there's a lot more standards to it than that. But the first of our 5 funds, New York City Employees Retirement System, just voted to adopt these as their standards. And I'm pleased to say that America's largest private equity real estate managers have worked together with us to develop them. And are going to work with us to promulgate them across a much broader set of pension funds and asset managers. And that doesn't solve every problem in housing, that's for sure. I'll talk about some of the other housing issues. But it's an example of the way we're trying to navigate this set of responsible investment issues. How do we invest in ways that deliver good returns, but be thoughtful stakeholders in the space? Because, you might be, well, I'll come back to that in a minute. So I just feel like that's a really good example of how we approach both those ESG questions, but they also are a good example for how we're approaching the city's housing policy challenges more generally. I'm just going to hustle over this a little because if you want to talk about housing policy issues, I'm glad to, but obviously we could spend much more than the whole time doing that. But just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from on what we need at the moment, given this just so urgent housing crisis we have in New York City. The housing and vacancy study shows now that vacancies in New York City rental market are now at 1.4%, and for units that are affordable to the median New Yorker at about 1%. That's the lowest they've been in decades. It is essentially impossible to find an apartment affordable to the average New Yorker in the marketplace. The asking rents average $3,500 citywide and closer to $4,000 in Manhattan. And of course, that means, if you're a young family trying to find a place, it's impossible. If you're trying to grow because you're going to have kids and you would like to buy something, nearly impossible. And if you're a tenant in one of those buildings I mentioned before, or of course, even more, a low-income or working class tenant, you're going to be facing, quite likely, a landlord who's thinking, I could get a lot more for this unit if I didn't have this pesky tenant in there right now. So it's not working for anyone, and that includes for employers who want to expand their business here but have to think about finding employees. So I think what we need is essentially a kind of all hands on deck, all of the above approach, because we need more housing supply. Part of the challenge is we simply don't have enough housing units. Housing supply has not kept up with job creation in New York City since the Great Recession, and we have a sizable gap there. Now, I don't think housing supply alone will deal with it. I really think of it as a 4-part stool. You need more supply, but you also need tenant protections in the meantime because the gap is so big that it will take us years, probably decades, even at breakneck speed of more building to get a better balanced market. And in the meantime, you can't let millions of tenants, like those ones I mentioned, be displaced from their homes. You need housing vouchers if you're going to help folks who are homeless or facing eviction, who of course can't afford that $3,500 or $4,000 unit. My office just did an audit in our audits shop of this intensive mobile treatment program that it responds to people on the street who are homeless and mentally ill with kind of a history of criminal justice involvement or substance abuse. And it tries to provide them services on the street, and that is great, but nobody gets well on the street. People cycle through jail, they cycle in and out of hospitals. And of course, what you need to be able to get some stability is a place to live. But but there are currently no housing vouchers dedicated so that team of people trying to help those folks could say, all right, we can put you in a unit, we can continue to wrap all these services around you, and then there's a chance you can stay on your medication and we can help you get well. But if you're going to do that, you need a pool of housing vouchers because otherwise, and then you also want to have some permanently affordable housing that is outside the more speculative marketplace, things like public housing or nonprofit-owned affordable rentals, or maybe my favorite are things like the old Mitchell-Lama program, which built affordable cooperatives that somebody might be able to buy for in current terms, let's say $200,000, so that's what they could afford. You can't find that almost anywhere in the New York City marketplace. And you can't sell it at market rent, but you can sell it for a bit more than you paid for it, build a little wealth in your family. So that's what Co-op City is, or amalgamated houses, or Penn South. We haven't built any housing like that in basically 60 years. So to me, a four-port stool: more supply, tenant protections, housing vouchers for the neediest, and some of this community-controlled or permanently affordable housing, both rental and homeownership. And we can talk more a little later about what it'll take at the state level and what it'll take at the city level to do better on all four of those things. But there's a lot of policies that could build more supply through favorable tax treatment and upzoning and some easing of some regulations. That will strengthen protections for tenants in buildings like the Greenbrook buildings. Those are called good cause eviction protections. That's what's being debated in Albany right now, and it would have prevented the eviction of those families from those Greenbrook buildings that were not covered by rent regulation. More housing vouchers, which is a thing both the city and the state are talking about, and more money for that permanently affordable housing as well. So we could do better on all those things. I'll mention just a couple of other things we're doing in the Comptroller's office specifically on housing, and then I'll move on to climate and infrastructure. You heard that we also manage the bonds, the municipal finance for New York City. Most of that goes for infrastructure, for building schools and our water and sewer system and our streets and bridges and infrastructure. But New York became the first city during the city's fiscal crisis in the 1980s to use city capital for affordable housing, to actually invest it as affordable housing subsidy, and we do it much more than the next many cities combined. And we found a new way to do that. We issued the city's first social bonds, targeted specifically for affordable housing, and that meant we've issued in 2 social bond issuances $1.5 billion of municipal debt finance to be provided as subsidy to 7,500 units of housing. And this is really low-income housing for low-income seniors, folks who have been homeless or very low income, because that city capital is functioning as the subsidy that's necessary to cover the difference between what truly low-income families can pay and what it costs to build and maintain the housing. So we're really excited. The first one of those social bonds won the Social Bond of the Year award, and I don't know how much competition there was, but we were very thrilled with it nonetheless. In our pension funds, in addition to this great responsible property management standards, we have a small sliver of our portfolio, about 1%, but still that sums up to about $2 billion, that it's invested in multifamily affordable housing in New York City. That's not subsidy. It's got to earn a rate of return, but it's long-term money that can provide for stability in multifamily housing. And we're actually going to be announcing soon an investment. I don't know if you remember when Signature Bank went belly up about a year ago. It had a whole lot of multifamily rent-stabilized buildings in its portfolio, and we're making an investment. The FDIC sold those off, and the packages with the most at-risk rent-stabilized housing was purchased by a consortium, including the Community Preservation Corporation and related. And we are their investor, bringing the city's pension funds into providing stability for exactly some of the most at-risk, about 35,000 rent-stabilized units around the city. So we're real excited about that. And we're leading the effort along with some city council members in a campaign we call Homes Now, Homes for Generations, to get a big city investment in that kind of housing I was talking about before, like a next generation of affordable cooperatives like those Mitchell-Lamas, or permanently affordable rental housing. So we're campaigning for $2 billion over 4 years to fund those programs. So that's our housing work. Happy to talk more about it in response to questions. We take a sort of similar approach in kind to our climate and infrastructure work. Obviously, those are similarly foundational issues for the city's thriving as the temperatures rise and the seas and tides rise, and we get more extreme rainfalls like we did in Hurricane Ida and Tropical Storm Ophelia. We're going to have more and more climate challenges, and our infrastructure is aging, and obviously we pray we won't have things like what happened in Baltimore, but the BQE is crumbling, and we need to be able to make the investments in improving it. And as we make infrastructure investments, those are opportunities to get it right or wrong on climate. You can just build a highway bigger than you had it before, or you can say, what can we do to reduce vehicle miles traveled, to increase transit options, to make a more sustainable city. So we're doing a lot of that work. The investment we finance through those bonds is really invested in resiliency and making sure there's better coastal protections and making sure we've got better storm drainage and all of that kind of work. And then in my oversight role, we try to make sure those projects actually get built. You know, Superstorm Sandy was over 10 years ago, and after it, we committed to a whole bunch of coastal resiliency projects, which we're basically only halfway done with, and it's going to be 2030 before we complete the coastal resiliency projects we decided to do a decade ago. So we're working hard to improve the speed with which the city can get its capital projects done. We've got a great new tracker up, the city's capital projects dashboard. We're trying to get some legislation passed in Albany to make it a little easier for the city to build those projects quickly. So that's on the infrastructure side. On the climate side, and I'll get to our friend downstairs now picketing me about BlackRock, that same $260 billion portfolio has a big climate impact. So, you know, if you've got a $260 billion portfolio, it's invested all across the global economy. We're in every asset class, in public equities, in fixed income, in private equity, in private credit, in real estate, and infrastructure, you know, on across the continents. You can't pick one sector or kind of one, say, we would just like to be, you know, in green technology. We're invested in utilities, and we're invested in auto companies, and we're invested in the banks that finance it. You know, we own basically a little bit of everything. And that means we own the emissions that come from those investments. And so a serious and thoughtful net zero plan, a plan committed to climate decarbonization, is saying, how do we think about the emissions that we finance and we are therefore responsible for throughout the economy? And we issued last year really what is amongst the U.S. public pension funds the most ambitious net zero plan of any public pension fund in the U.S., with the goal of being net zero by 2040 and a lot of specifics about how to get there. So disclosure across what are called scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And then a real commitment to work with all our asset managers and our portfolio companies on what their plans are. You know, so you'll use the utility sector as an example. We have investments in many utility companies. Almost all of them, 90% of them, set goals for net zero after the Paris Accords. They almost all adopted net zero commitments or goals. Anyone want to guess out of the 90% so that's step one, you set a goal. And then if you're serious about it, you put a decarbonization plan forward and you use what are called science-based targets. And there's entities that take a look at your plan and confirm that it complies with science, that you've got science-based targets to actually hit your commitments. So out of the 90% of utilities, what percent do you think have a plan covered by science-based targets to meet their goals? It's better than zero. It's not zero. 11%. So that's the gap we got to be working on right now. There's a big agreement. We need to get to net zero, but the work to do there is a lot, and people aren't doing it. And that really is where we're focused. So we did a meeting recently with our utilities and said, you know, who are the acceptable certifiers, and what are you doing? Because by a year from now, we want to see 70% of our financed emissions covered by science-based targets, and that includes all of you. So we're deeply involved in work kind of across our portfolio. Now, there are a lot of opportunities in climate transition investing, and you'll hear a lot about this. So if you're saying, where can I make money by investing in the climate transition? There are so many great opportunities, and the Inflation Reduction Act juiced them by providing a lot of additional tax incentives. And we're lucky. We have now over $10 billion of investments in EV manufacturers and EV charging station installers and solar and wind and folks who do building decarbonization. There's a lot of great opportunities and incentives, again, IRA enhanced. to make real money in climate transition investing. And that is great. And we're hoping to get it up from 10 billion to 35 billion over the next couple of years. But a real concern I have is that's where most investors will talk with you about what their plan for climate transition is how they're making money on scaling up renewables and climate solutions. And that is great. But what's currently happening is we're scaling up our climate solutions without scaling down our fossil fuel investments. And as a result, we're just increasing energy use overall. And unless people move to those science-based targets, are serious about decarbonization, we're not going to get there. And so far, the banks haven't been willing to say, we're going to shift our lending practices and stop lending on new fossil fuel infrastructure and extraction. So we've just introduced, and actually we've settled now with JP Morgan Chase and Citi, and hopefully we're getting close with a couple of others. We brought shareholder resolutions, which is something you can do if you're an investor through the public markets, and get other investors to vote. And the last 2 years, the climate shareholder resolutions have not done very well. And a set of folks like the woman downstairs have been pushing resolutions that say no more fossil fuel lending by Chase or Citi. And we voted for those resolutions, but they only got like 11% of investors voting for them. And so we came back this year with something that we had worked on with some folks in the banking industry and proposed something else. We proposed that they disclose the ratios of lending on clean energy to lending on fossil fuel projects. And we believe the average right now is about 2 to 1 fossils to clean. The International Energy Agency says that it's got to get to 4 to 1 in the other direction. You know, there can still be some, there's going to continue to be some lending on fossil projects, but if it doesn't get to 4 to 1 clean to fossils by 2035, we're simply going to blow past not just 1.5, but probably 2 degrees of warming. So we brought those resolutions, and I'm just delighted. I didn't know how they would do, but Citi and JP Morgan agreed to do this. So we withdrew the resolutions. We'll be going to votes at Goldman and Morgan Stanley and Wells Fargo and Bank of America. So that's just another model of this work to do responsible investing in a way that says, you know, we want to keep investing, but we need to be pushing this transition forward. Now, sometimes we do say enough is enough. We have divested our public equities investments from fossil fuel reserve owners. So the pension funds are not invested in Exxon or Chevron or other major fossil fuel reserve owners. And there's a big debate over the value of divestment versus engagement. We're big believers in essentially doing both. And I have to say, part of why those utility companies are taking our engagement seriously is that they know we're serious about it because we have done some divesting and much rather work with them to get under science-based targets. But if they don't think there's any point at which we'd be serious about it, then why would they really engage? So that is our approach to climate. I guess I should say a little more about BlackRock and KKR, just because you probably got the flyer on the way in. So BlackRock's our biggest asset manager. They manage $60 billion for New York City's 5 pension funds. They're the largest asset manager in the world in public equities. And as a result, they're the largest investor in fossil fuels because basically they're the largest investor in everything. They don't actually act that differently than State Street or Vanguard here. But there's a set of folks who say, look, you divested from fossil fuels, that's great. You got to divest from BlackRock. And I have had a lot of conversations with BlackRock about strengthening their climate practice. And I'm pretty frustrated with them at the moment because they and others have actually been taking steps backwards. The backlash against ESG investing has persuaded them and others to withdraw from something called Climate Action 100, which was investors doing exactly what I talked about with utilities and other companies. So I've had hard, you know, Larry Fink and I spoke for about a half hour when that happened 2 weeks ago. And I think it is important that BlackRock's customers hear from them that we have expectations for what our asset managers will do. And we've set clear expectations for what we expect our asset managers to do over the next 1, 3, and 5 years. But we had a rational basis for divesting from fossil fuel reserve owners. We did a 2-year study. We concluded that it wasn't going to be good for our funds in the long term. You can't just kind of randomly and arbitrarily say, okay, here are some protesters that would like me to pull money from one firm that's not really that different from the other firms. And so what we've tried to have is a really diligent, legally defensible, comprehensive plan that sets expectations for all our managers. I get why campaigners like to have one target to, throw darts at, but that doesn't make it possible for me to move money in that way. I do find it a little amusing. They then added KKR to the flyer also, and I think they think that like BlackRock is bad and also private equity is bad, and I've tried to say, look, there's only really public markets, private markets, and under my mattress. And there's not great returns under my mattress, so we can't have a strategy that says, we're gonna totally disengage. We have to have a strategy that says we'll be thoughtful about this set of investments, we'll be aggressive in the ways that we engage, but we are going to be thoughtful and responsible for what we're financing. So that's housing, that's climate. I'm not going to go on too much about other areas, but we're equally ambitious, if not more so, in workers' rights. We brought a shareholder resolution at Starbucks that helped make change there. Through private markets, we've persuaded a couple of our big hotel owners to enter into neutrality agreements with their unions at the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas and with Brookfield. And over 10,000 workers now have gotten to join unions because of organizing neutrality agreements. We've got a great responsible contractor policy in our real estate portfolio, so a lot of good work there. Really good work also, and this is the work that Taffy leads, to make sure that we're looking at our asset manager diversity so that the people who are managing the money of all these, the pensioners of New York City are a diverse bunch. But the asset managers of American assets are not a diverse bunch. And, it'd be weird to say we believe we should diversify geographically and across asset classes and across business size and across business sectors, but it's fine to have 98.6% of our funds owned by white men. But that is the American percentage of asset management in asset managers. And our funds started when we got here at 11.65% managed by MWBE, minority and women-owned businesses. Through Taffy's work and our team's work, we've boosted that to 12.68% in the first year. That was $2.6 billion more in the hands of Black and brown and women asset managers. We got a long way to go, but we have really serious plans for doing it. And in addition to that, we look at who's working for the companies. Oh, I got to get to questions. All right. Good. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here because I did promise to come back to this question of sort of the Ackman Lecture. By coincidence, I was recently out with Al Sharpton in a protest outside of not Larry Ackman, but Bill Ackman's office, defending the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. And that wasn't so much in my role as comptroller, that was in my role as like a Jewish New Yorker who believes that Jews won't be made safer by attacking the Civil Rights Coalition, that Jews, like everybody else, will be made safer in a world where everybody is able to have more opportunities. Inequality and economic insecurity, those are the kinds of times when anti-Semitism rises, not falls. And I really think that just matches the perspective that I'm talking about more broadly, because maybe a few investors can make money by kicking people out of their homes, but pretty quickly, if everybody did it, the whole housing market would be unstable. And maybe a few investors can do well by betting on oil going up when Russia invades Ukraine, but if we all keep investing in fossil fuels, then we're going to burn up trillions of dollars. And if we can instead invest responsibly in ways that make more economic security in housing and in a climate transition and in a more inclusive set of opportunities for people to start businesses and invest, we will all collectively reap the benefits. And that is what I believe ethics looks like in investing. Thank you very much, and I'm excited for your questions.
Let's start it off in the back of the room. All the way in the back of the room, we have a question. Tell us your name and where you're from before you give the question.
Hi, my name is Robin. I'm an adjunct actually teaching innovation, and I'm also a female founder working on a joint venture. My question actually would love if you could elaborate on your, you mentioned MWB, so maybe it's a good segue, specifically because I am one of those founders, and I can name you at least a dozen women who, so first, I'm sure you're allocated to some of the key people like the Grosvenor and Artemis, but they're clearly not deploying money, and I know many horror stories. I also know bad stories by women who've been told because they, great idea, but because you are a woman, and they've used male genitalia, even last night to one of my friends, I'm not going to fund you. Like explicitly said that, and the woman walked out of the meeting, and they're by all the names you've just mentioned tonight, so I would love to know kind of your plans, and for those women, how they can raise their concerns, like explicitly, because if they were an employee, it'd be a serious allegation, and I would think, I just was so upset last night, and this happened to be, but I would love to hear kind of your plans and like ways that these women who are being told because they're women they're not going to get funded can let you know which GPs are treating them like this. And they're not being treated nicely, they're being treated like shit. Sorry. I know it's like not PC,
No,
but it's
I
really
wish I
humiliating,
could
the
express
stories.
surprise. I mean, I'm sorry for that, but I'm not that surprised by it. Investment continues to be both as I say, 98.6% of U.S. assets under management broadly are in firms owned by white men, and it's a culture in many cases that reflects that. There are good efforts to change that, but they're far from where they need to be. I mean, to your question about alerting us to practices by folks that we might do business with that we would want to learn about. Taffy Iodelli leads that work in our office, and you should meet her, and she's working really hard inside our shop with our consultants, with the folks who run our emerging manager programs and funds across our asset classes, and working hard to make sure that they are creating opportunities for people like you and others, that there is a long way to go. We've got a whole detailed plan that's on our website for what our plan is, and we believe if we implement it the way we'd be able to go from 11.65% where we started at 12.6% last year to 15% in the next year or two, and up to 20% by 2029. So and we've got really detailed plans across our asset classes. But I really take your point, and please help us.
Another question, please. Yes, right there. You in the white shirt, stand up. Tell us where you're from.
Hi, my name is Avram. I'm an alumni from Schack, real estate development course. Two questions. You mentioned earlier about the homelessness problem we have here in New York, and also with the vouchers that the city is introducing. I've noticed that the vouchers have increased substantially from last year to this year, over 20%, depending on the size of the bedrooms. First question is, how sustainable is that for New York City to support and fund this? And then the second question is this the right answer for New York City to continually spend money on this to solve a problem, or is there other options?
Both great questions. By itself, New York City cannot afford the level of housing vouchers that we would need. I mean, for many years, the only housing vouchers were federal. So Section 8, or what are now called housing choice vouchers, are a long-standing federal program. But they basically haven't been increased now in many, many years. I mean, the rents go up a little with fair market rent calculations, but unless Congress allocates more money, that you either have fewer vouchers or, So the city has started a relatively new program a couple years ago called City FEPS, and the council is trying to expand it substantially, and the mayor is saying, no, we can't afford it, and they're in court against each other right now. And yes, then if you want landlords to take those vouchers, you have to pay enough to rent the units. A big missing link here is the state, which doesn't have a housing voucher program, and there is legislation to create the Housing Access Voucher Program. Those vouchers really need to be thoughtfully targeted because we can't afford, I mean, the number, it's like most New York households that can't afford the rent, and we can't afford vouchers for everyone. But I think some targeted vouchers make a lot of sense, and I give the example of that intensive mobile treatment program. There's only 837 families in that program, though, individuals, and those are the folks most at risk of themselves dying on the street or in a psychotic episode, being somebody who pushes someone in front of a train. So, like, let's take 837 vouchers and get those folks off the street and get them well before they harm themselves or others. We'll save money, honestly, if we target it in that way. Other things we can do, I mentioned a little. I mean, we do need to build a lot more housing, and there's money to be made in building it, and increasing supply overall will help over time. But I think it's worth substantial subsidy in affordable housing, because otherwise we can't keep a diverse and inclusive city, and I just think that's what's the best thing about New York. You know, if you go to San Francisco, it is no longer a diverse place because it's only very expensive housing, and we gotta use the combination of rent regulation and housing affordability investments if we want this city to stay diverse.
Okay, next question. Yes.
I'm John Santoro. I'm an adjunct instructor. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm John Santoro. I'm an adjunct instructor at NYU. I'm in the communications ethics area. Could you talk? I moved to New York City in 1977. Paid $210 for my first apartment. Could you talk a little bit about what killed Mitchell Lama? Because it just seemed like a brilliant program, and a lot of people grew up in it. I remember the first thing you did, you moved to New York and you signed up for Mitchell Lama. And ironically, I got approved for Mitchell Lama the day I was moving out of New York City. But could you talk a little bit about it? And could you talk about the potential successor program?
Yeah. So the way they designed the Mitchell Lama program, it really relied on very large tracts of vacant land. You know, it's like Co-op City or Penn South or amalgamated houses. And so largely through the 50s and 60s, they sort of built out the vacant land. Then the fiscal crisis hit, and they looked at all these abandoned buildings, and they really, wound up dealing with a sort of set of preservation and abandonment questions. And then really what happened is all these neighborhoods that folks thought didn't have any value came to have value through kind of gentrification and growth. And so now we have a lot of affordable housing programs, but 80% of the subsidies and tax breaks are to for-profit private developers to build rental housing. And it's kind of a sort of industry of that. And that idea of like, what we should do is make it possible and put the incentives in building a co-op. Somebody's got to get paid to develop it, but they should get their developer fee and then, turn it over to the residents as a co-op. It just is kind of lost in history, but there's a lot of people pushing for it to come back.
Next question. Yes. Gentleman, the handsome gentleman standing there. Tell them who you are and what your question is.
Hi, my name is Jacob Bijou. I'm currently a student in Schack undergrad, both in Professor Schwegel's class and Professor Tayyip's class. I was wondering, because you mentioned that we have an affordability housing crisis in New York City that, of course, we're all aware of, and you mentioned it a bunch of times that it's due to the housing supply. But I was wondering that because the elimination of the 421A abatement, that kind of doesn't promote development, and developers are going to want to develop less because they're not getting either tax breaks, credits, or abatements. So there's less supply, and then obviously we know supply and demand, so there's going to be more demand, and then that leaves the landlords the ability to charge more rent, and it kind of just goes back into a whirlwind that there's still an affordability crisis. I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, if you could please share.
Yeah, so this is the big debate that's happening right now in Albany. I mean, they were supposed to wrap up the budget by the end of the month, but they just gave themselves an extension. I don't know if you ask your professors for an extension, but Albany just asked all of us for an extension, and they should really get back to work, in my opinion. But so this 421A tax exemption expired a couple of years ago. There was a bit of a hangover because lots of people applied right before the deadline. So probably there was like 2 years worth of applications. But we need, we are going to get very little multifamily housing built without some new tax treatment. Now, how to do that? How big a tax break to give? How much affordable housing to require, and what to require in terms of the trades unions expect that, for providing giant tax breaks, that there also be wage standards. That's the debate, and people are busy working out that set of questions about how big a tax break, how affordable, what the wages will be. And last year they failed to reach a deal, partly because they couldn't get a deal on the 421A issues, but partly because the tenants movement doesn't love the 421A because it just seems like a big tax break giveaway to real estate developers, but they're mostly willing to live with it as long as they get the good cause eviction protections that'll keep those Greenbrook tenants in their home. And there is a deal to be made there. There was last spring, and people just didn't kind of knock heads together and say, you can't get out of this room until you solve those questions. There is a deal to be made on, some replacement for 421A and on good cause, and I really hope they get it done. They're not going to get it done by the end of the month, but within the next couple of weeks, because you're right, we really need it.
Okay. Yes. Someone there. Stand up. Give us your name. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Adam, a grad student at Schack right now. Forgive me, I also have a housing question. There are a huge volume of the so-called zombie apartments that exist in New York that are, currently empty, and it's sort of a catch-22 that the landlords say that they can't get enough money to fix the apartments and put them back on the market. They can't raise the rent enough to pay to renovate these units. I've heard a figure from a grad professor at Schack, that there could be up to 200,000 of these zombie units in New York City. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on these and how a solution that there may be to address this.
So we just did a deep dive on this, and the report's on our website because we really dug in. And we found it to be the data says it's not nearly as big a problem as some of the noise around it. I mean, that drop, that I mentioned, that 1.4% vacancy, that's part of what's called the Housing and Vacancy Study, and they do it every 3 years. And the drop from 2021 to 2024 in vacancies was extraordinary. And if you dig in and look at the questions of unrentable vacancies, units that are off the market for any reason, every single one of those things dropped pretty significantly. It's pretty clear what happened was that there was a big jump in the pandemic, and there were a lot of vacancies in the first year of the pandemic, and that they've come down. Now, that's not to say it's not a problem. There are a meaningful number of units like that, and a solution is needed. But the data report we put out says the data doesn't show it at anything like the numbers that you'd been hearing. We recommend 2 solutions for it. Well, really 3 solutions. One, they should increase the amount you're allowed to charge for improvements you make on a vacancy of a unit. So, if a tenant moves out and now you have to redo the kitchen or the bathroom, right now you're limited, I think, to $15,000 a unit that you can sort of then raise in the rent. So we recommend doubling that to 30, and that would go a pretty long way to enabling individual apartment increases. Second, those vouchers that we want to make sure exist, we propose targeting those toward these units and letting people take the full value of the voucher that, you just heard, it's, even if the regulated rent would be lower, if you take a tenant who's coming out of shelter or somebody who's low income, so now you got more rent roll. And then third, for those portfolios, and it's a pretty small handful, but there are some where it's now reached a problem for the portfolio itself, we propose, some of this is in the funding that I mentioned, we're advocating for, to provide resources for nonprofits and other preservation purchasers who will commit to keep it affordable for the long term, put some public capital into buying them, fixing them up, and keeping them affordable for the long run.
Okay, one last question, because there's food and drink available, and
I see 2 hands. Why don't we let can we let the two hands here?
especially the gentleman way in the back.
Oh, that's 3. But all right, why don't we take all 3 questions and I'll try to remember them and answer them.
Hi, my name's Thru, and I'm a master's student at Schack. So I was wondering, you mentioned that utility companies are increasing their renewables, but they're not decreasing their dependence on fossil fuels. So what do you think it will take for them to decrease it? Like, is it policy? Is that the only avenue? And if so, why doesn't it exist?
Great. Okay, let's take all 3 and then I'll answer them, because then I'll go on and on less. Most of the problem is mine. It's me, not you guys.
Great to be here today. I'm Luke DiGiovanni from Professor Schwegel's class as well. I've been reading up on ESG for the past 2 years after I was in his ESG class, which was amazing. And I'd like to know if you've spoken with BlackRock since they're rebranding to transition investing from ESG to focus less on the social and governance side of ESG, which, as they say, will primarily be about the environmental side, but that they're going to be ignoring corporate behavior, social issues.
Okay, this I can remember the two we have. You want to put the third one on the table? It's all right. You sure? Okay, all right. Okay, and they're somewhat related actually. But so for BlackRock, yes. I mean, as I mentioned, I spoke to Larry Fink personally for about a half hour. I don't know, 2 weeks ago or so, because that rebranding, like part of it went along with their withdrawal from this group Climate Action 100, and the concern I really have, and these two questions go together, and it's sort of what I said. When I said that, like, what investors are happy to talk to you about are where they're able to make investments in things that are scaling up climate solutions. So they're investing in wind farms and solar and EVs, and those things are doing well. They're gaining market share. They get IRA tax credits. Now, they're mostly private markets rather than public markets investments, and BlackRock just bought the biggest infrastructure company, BPI, and is scaling up their private markets investments in climate transition, and that's great. I don't have any problem with it. But what they're pulling back from doing is exactly these issues of saying to all the companies that they own through the public markets, which is like they didn't divest from fossil fuels, so fossil fuel companies and banks and car companies and utilities, to demand as owners that they have plans to scale down their fossil fuel extraction. And without that, this is what's going to happen, is that we will build out more solar and wind and EVs, but people aren't just going to kind of make all the transitions, without stronger laws or real pressure from their investors. And this gets to your question. It's not just utilities. I was using utilities as an example. Utilities in this instance have to sell, they got to provide the power that their customers are using, and so they're buying it from somewhere, and they won't mind transitioning to wind and solar as it comes to exist. But it's essentially the same question. In addition to incentives to scale up renewables, we need something that will push banks to stop lending on new extraction, and utilities to make sure that they're making the transition, and car makers to actually make the transitions and scale down. And look, that means leaving fossil fuels in the ground that have value today. The best would be government policy to do that, a carbon tax or serious public policy that would require it. But in the absence of that, investors do have a real role to play, demanding science-based targets and real credible transition. That's why we're bringing those resolutions at the banks and pushing on the utility companies. I hope other asset owners, who like us are broadly invested across the economy and have long-term obligations, will join us as well so we can do it. Because if we don't either get better laws or significantly better and more coordinated investor pressure, then I fear we will scale up renewables, but we just won't take down fossils on the time that we have. Thank you very much for all these great questions.
The bar is open. There's going to be food in the back. Let's mix and mingle. Great networking tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.